Morning, Team Alabama. We are ready for page 142. Please find it on your Chromebooks and be ready to read along with me. That's page 142 in chapter 11. Georgie felt a sadness inside him. He knew what it meant to be lonesome. And he thought it must be very sad to have Paul and his father dead. He knew too, however, that he could never forget the morning that Mrs. Harper screamed at him, threatening his rosebush, or the wild, mean dreams that he'd had of her when his fever was high. He felt as if two Georgies were fighting inside him, one pushing in a certain direction, the other quickly pushing back in the other. His heart pounded that evening as he pulled his choir robe on and then stood before Sister Mary Angela, who adjusted the white collar and brushed his hair smoothly across his forehead before going down to the road to perform the same service for each boy. She will hear me sing. Maybe she will know that my voice is helping to make it beautiful. He tried hard to remember that he didn't care whether she heard him or not, and that her thinking that he was good meant nothing to him, or nothing at all to him. The chill outside made the chapel seem warm and friendly that evening. There were lighted candles on the organ, and when Mrs. Harper came in, she brought a great basket of late flowers from her garden, which Sister Dolores accepted and placed at the feet of the choir boys in the front row. They filled the organ loft with fragrance, and Mrs. Harper looked very beautiful as she sat with Robin near the front of the chapel. Her long braids were twisted into a crown around her head, as if for a very special occasion, and she wore a soft-looking dress of blue silk with gold flowers on her high collar. Georgie had never seen her except in her careless work clothes that she wore in the garden. "She dressed up nice for us," he thought, and caught his breath as he looked at her. Then he fixed his eyes upon Sister Mary Angela and kept his thoughts on the choral the choir was going to sing. Every boy sat unmoving and watchful until at a sign from Sister Mary Angela they rose, faces alert, eyes never moving from her. The organ whispered a low command, and they sang sweetly and beautifully, obeying Sister's every direction. At first, the voices were soft and quietly reverent. Then they swelled with the power as the tones of the organ swelled. The choral became so strong and rich that Georgie felt his Rose must be hearing it over in the garden. Finally, the voices in the organ grew softer and softer until there was only a breath of music at the end. And when the choir had allowed the last note to fade away, Georgie stole a glance at Mrs. Harper. She was crying. When the brief service was over, the choir boys filed out of the side door from the organ loft and stood in the small room off the foyer until the student body had marched out into the front hall. Sister Mary Angela stood with them, and when she saw Mrs. Harper approaching, she hurried towards her with an outstretched hand. "It was good of you to come over this evening, Mrs. Harper. Do come in and say a word to my choir boys. They are very pleased that you came over to hear them sing." "I came to thank them, sister. Their singing was beautiful. Very close to being magnificent. It made me cry, but I feel better for having heard them." The boys were crowding around her, proud of their accomplishment and ready to bask in her praise. Georgie stood in the background, allowing himself to be hidden by the older boys in the crowded room. Once he ventured near enough that he could have touched her dress, but he would not say one word to attract her attention. He patted Robin's head briefly, and the child prattled an attempt to say his name. But Georgie could not talk to Robin there, and so he withdrew to the farthest point in the room and tried not to wonder if she had recognized him in his handsome robe, if she had heard his voice with something called a perfect pitch blending in with the others. A few days earlier, Sister Mary Angela called all of the 8 or 9-year-old boys into her office for a special announcement. "How would you like to study dramatics and perhaps give a play later on before the student body?" she asked. There was a wild and enthusiastic response, and Georgie was excited and delighted at the prospect that he had gone with Sister Mary Angela and a dozen other boys earlier in the fall to see a production of Pinocchio at the Children's Theater in a neighboring town. He had sat hardly breathing as he watched children no older than himself perform a storybook miracle on the stage. He had dreamed about that vivid first experience for weeks afterwards. A lot of work is involved, Sister Mary Angela was saying. Classes will have to be held after school hours, and that will mean that you may have to give up other activities that you enjoy if you enter the dramatics class. It won't be altogether a lark. There will be hard work and some sacrifices to be made. Are you going to teach us, sister? Timothy asked curiously as a small suspicion began to grow in his mind. No, Tim, Mrs. Harper will teach the new classes, and for the first term she wants to work with boys your age. I think you may probably know why. Paul? Timothy said quickly. Yes, because of Paul, Sister Mary Angela answered. She stopped for a minute and seemed to be thinking, and then she said, when Mrs. Harper heard the boys' choir the other night, she began to wonder if maybe it would make her feel better if she could work with the boys who were Paul's age. She didn't know at first what kind of work she could do, but when we talked it over, we thought that since she is an actress, she might teach you boys how to act out stories, maybe put on a play for the older boys. There was enthusiastic yelling at Sister Mary Angela's words. Georgie didn't yell. He knew that Sister Mary Angela was looking at him, but he wouldn't look back at her. Of course you can do as you please about taking the class, Sister Mary Angela said. Some of you may be more interested in other things. Some of you may not care about acting, but would like to build sets or paint scenery. There are so many things to be done despite acting when we put on a play, and we want this to be a pleasant experience for everybody. Then she told the boys that Mr. Collier would be writing dramatized versions of scenes from various books for their class. He is coming over every day for the next week or so and will read to you so that you'll be familiar with the stories that you are acting out. He will read parts of Treasure Island, of Tom Sawyer, several scenes from Alice in Wonderland, and maybe some poems, which he thinks would be fun for you to dramatize. Mrs. Harper mentioned The King's Breakfast, which Paul used to like so much. Georgie sat in on the reading sessions. Boys crowded so close to Mr. Collier that his head was only a spot of silver among the black and brown, red and blonde heads around him. His voice was lively, often full of laughter or ominous with predictions of disaster, as he read the great old stories to them. When Georgie listened to Tom Sawyer slyly luring the boys into whitewashing the fence for Aunt Polly, or to the bloody pirates talking while Jim Hawkins listened as he lay crouched in the apple barrel, he was half sick with the longing to join Mrs. Harper's class. He had not yet read Alice in Wonderland, but as the White Rabbit, the Duchess, the Hatter, and Alice, as well as a dozen others, became real and living characters, Georgie could hardly stay with his decision never to be friendly with Mrs. Harper. I wish she hadn't have been mean, he thought to himself. I wish she hadn't have pulled up my rose bush or said the things she did. I wish I didn't have to keep her for my enemy. Once Sister Mary Angela spoke to him in privately about the dramatics class. You sing so well, Georgie. And you enjoy singing, don't you? Yes, ma'am, I like to sing, if you're the one that teaches us. Now that you know that you can do things well, you've learned to read and to sing. Don't you think it would be fun to be in a play? Mrs. Harper has told me that she'd be happy to have you in her class. There was the same sullen shake of his head when Mrs. Harper's name was mentioned. Sister Mary Angela's face took on a look of tiredness as she watched him turn away from her. The tire is still spinning in the icy rut, isn't it, Georgie? It's still cutting deeper and deeper and getting positively nowhere. Later, he sat beside his rosebush and sulked. Never, 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 was all he could manage to say, and then remembering the crowd of boys in the auditorium yelling with the delight at being accepted in the class, he added, a bunch of dumb idiots, and told himself that he had better things to do than act in a play. Is Georgie really happy about not being in the play? What makes you think that? Why won't he allow himself to participate in that play? what does it mean to be stuck in an icy rut? Okay? Think about those and let's add a couple of facts. Have a great rest of your day, Team Alabama.